I'm speaking with Kabir Nath, CEO of Compass Pathways. Thank you for coming on the channel today, Kabir. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks, Jake, for the invitation. It's great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Me as well. So, I think, yeah, I know Psychedelic Vantage subscribers. A lot of them probably are familiar with your background and the work Compass is doing. But for those who aren't familiar and maybe new to the channel, can you share a bit about your background, what led you to your role at Compass Pathways, and could you also speak to Compass Pathways' mission?
Sure, very happy to do that. So let me start with Compass Pathways. Compass Pathways is a company focused on finding and bringing to market innovative new treatments for the treatment of serious mental illness. And the reason we're so focused on that is we know that there's a real lack of effective treatments for people suffering from mental illnesses such as treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, and we'll get into that much more in a moment. I came to Compass through a very interesting route. Before this, I was running a company called Otsuka, which some of you will know as a very traditional Japanese neuropsych company, but one that was very focused on mental health. It was the company that actually discovered aripiprazole, better
Mm.
known as Abilify, and the follow-on drugs from there. And I was leading that company in the US and ultimately globally. And around 6 or 7 years ago, as there was the resurgence of interest in psychedelics, we started to take a look. And so we had a team take a look at what was happening, take a look at some of the emerging science, talk to many of the renowned figures in the field. And within about 6 months, Otsuka arrived at clinical conviction to say these one day were going to be new tools for patients living with serious mental illness. It's a Japanese company, so whether that was going to take 3 years, 5 years, or 15 years didn't really matter, but we were convinced there was a need to engage here. So back in 2019, we said, well, now what do we do? And so we saw that there was this small private company in London called Compass Pathways, and we went to visit them. And we developed a relationship over time. I spent significant time with George and Katya, the co-founders, and Lars, all three of them. And ultimately, Otsuka ended up leading the Series B for Compass Pathways. And that was really more of a validation for Compass. Perhaps wasn't in the light of things the best investment for Otsuka, but still, it was really a sign of our commitment and interest in the space. Fast forward a couple of years, and the board of Compass, with great gratitude to George, decided it was time to evolve the management and have somebody with a much more extensive drug development commercialization background come on board. And long story short, 9 months of discussions later, I was thrilled to join Compass as CEO. But having known George and Katya for a number of years, having known the company, having observed it, very, very excited to do so. And thrilled to this day, 3 years later, that I'm here with this, enormous opportunity
Mhm.
and responsibility ahead of me to bring COM360 hopefully to patients.
I remember learning about the news of you joining Compass, and I was certainly very excited. And I know the entire psychedelic space was as well. So, before getting into the recently released phase 3 data in treatment resistant depression, I think it is important for the listeners to be reminded what is treatment resistant depression?
Really glad you focused on that because it is so important. And let's be clear, treatment-resistant depression is a horrible phrase. So let me unpack that a little. Around 21 million people in the US are diagnosed with what we call major depressive disorder, with depression. And a significant number of those people do indeed receive treatment. Around 11 to 12 million get treatment, though many do not.
Mhm.
And what many of you will be familiar with is the cycle thereafter. People will perhaps respond to an SSRI, if not to a first one, to a second one, or maybe a different mechanism, or maybe augmentation, and so on. But over time, what we see is fully a third of patients simply cease to respond to anything.
Mhm.
Either they never did, or whatever they did respond to initially is no longer working. So this is what we could call, shall we say, chronic refractory depression, persistent depression. Many people will have had depressive episodes spanning years. They'll have had many of them. And while there's no official kind of DSM definition of TRD, any psychiatrist will tell you that they know that patient. It's the patient who's tried all sorts of different things, who's tried perhaps to get to some sort of intervention like ketamine, like TMS, but the patient for whom really none of the traditional approaches, the traditional oral daily approaches are working. And this is a group of patients where some 70% have lifetime experience of either suicidal thinking or even suicide attempts. There's data suggesting a majority of these people struggle to hold down a full-time job because this is a debilitating condition,
Hmm.
not just physically, but emotionally, socially, in every way. So
Yeah.
this really is a chronic and huge problem. And that's why from the get-go, Compass focused on this group of patients.
Definitely seems to be an underserved patient population worldwide and also in America. When I think about, again, as you mentioned, a horrible phrase, but treatment resistant depression, TRD, I always come back to, the well-known STAR-D study. And, in that study, we saw very low response and remission rates with oral antidepressants once patients reach third line treatment. So my understanding is this could be switching to a tricyclic, augmentation strategies as well. With that approach in this study, we're looking at 13 to 14% remission rates here. What I'd like to ask you is, how do we move towards a model where once someone meets TRD criteria, they gain access to treatments that have demonstrated adequate efficacy in this population? And are we already moving in this direction at all now?
I would say we're moving, but way too slowly. And so a few factors there, and you raise a really, really important point. So let's take esketamine, Spravato. We know that that is the only drug that is approved for TRD that's actually routinely used today. There
Mhm.
is one very old combination that's not really used, but in terms of drugs with a specific approval for this, esketamine is the most used drug. And again, that potentially can be used third line, and to the extent you see prior auths and so on, they're typically open to that being used third line.
Mhm.
What we actually see is it being reserved for fifth or later lines typically.
Okay.
So what's happening is patients are being cycled by physicians through generics multiple times. And you see a phenomenon where somebody will go from one psychiatrist to another, and perhaps, inevitably today, what happens is another psychiatrist will again start them on an SSRI or something, even though there's plenty of evidence that's unlikely to be effective.
Yeah.
So we need to move much more aggressively to getting people to interventional treatments, to novel treatments, to treatments that have been demonstrated to really have an impact in that population more quickly. Be that ketamine, be that esketamine, be that TMS, be that in future psychedelics if they're approved. There's work for all of us to do. Clearly, as manufacturers and sponsors, there's a big burden on us, but there's a lot around educating physicians as well around the need to get there. And there's a lot, I think there's a big role also for patient advocacy. Ultimately, patients need to advocate for this to be able to have access more quickly. But just as a step back, this, though, is why Compass is dedicated to pursuing the regulatory route through the FDA, which will allow us to get in front of insurers and government payers and so on, because we know most of those 3 million people I referenced earlier depend on those channels to pay for their drugs. And we want to meet those patients where they are. That's not to defend the system as being a great system today, but we need to meet the patients where they are in the system today and together evolve the system.
So generating the data will be very important on this mission, and Compass is running the largest phase 3 program in the psychedelic space by a lot, actually. Can you walk us through the Comp 005 top line results that were recently released?
So first thing to remember is that this was a limited data release as we had always previewed, because as a reminder of the design of Comp 005, while the primary endpoint is at 6 weeks, the study continues fully blinded to 26 weeks, during which patients may have the option, subject to certain retreatment criteria, of a second dose. So what we put out was first that at 6 weeks, we saw a highly statistically significant separation between 25 milligrams and the pure placebo arm, with a change from baseline MADRS difference of 3.6, which is clinically meaningful. Importantly, we also saw a statement from the DSMB confirming that they saw no significant safety events nor any clinically concerning imbalance around suicidality. And as a reminder, that look from the DSMB was not just on 6 weeks of 005. It was everything they're seeing to date in both 005 and 006, so a much richer patient set than that. So that was the primary endpoint data for 005. And what's really important is first, it's highly consistent with the phase 2b. So in our phase 2b, though the primary endpoint was at 3 weeks, we did actually see a separation of just over 4 points at 6 weeks, again, statistically significant. So we see that consistent efficacy, and we also see a very clean safety profile in that. So that was what we released in June.
Thank you for the overview, Kabir. A couple follow-up questions about Comp 005. What is the most uh, amount of treatments, dosing sessions someone can receive throughout the 52-week study?
In 005, it's 3. So there
Okay.
is the initial treatment at baseline. From week 6 to 26, patients have the option of another treatment subject to certain retreatment criteria. And then in the open label portion from weeks 26 to 52, everyone has the option of a 25 milligram dose. So potentially somebody could get 3 25 milligram doses in Part A, Part B, and Part C.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And I was listening to Chief Patient Officer at Compass, Steve Levine, at a Canaccord Genuity conference. And I just want to confirm with you because I was excited to hear that once Comp 005 26-week data is released, and that's my understanding when Part A completes in Comp 006, will we see a fuller data set when that comes out?
Absolutely. So with the 26-week data of 005, we'll see a complete data set, including the time course up to 6 weeks and beyond 6 weeks, and a full safety data set.
Awesome. So yeah, no, I was encouraged to see the 3.6 point delta. Compass had been saying 3 would be clinically meaningful and anything above is a plus. And also the message from the DSMB was very encouraging. So now I'd love to ask you about, I'm really excited about this study, the design of Comp 006.
Yeah. So as a reminder, let me take you back briefly to the phase 2b.
Okay.
So we designed our phase 2b right back starting in around 2018. And Dr. Guy Goodwin, who's now our chief medical officer, led the design of that. He led a collaborative group through that. And Guy was already thinking about many of the questions that are fundamental to the study of psychedelics, in particular, this question around blinding or unblinding and managing expectancy. So as a reminder, that study had 3 arms, 25 milligrams, because the general consensus was that would be the active dose for depression. A subtherapeutic but actual dose of 1 milligram to kind of mimic placebo, and then an intermediate dose, and we chose 10. And again, this was first because we hoped to show a true dose response in kind of classic PK/PD style, but also because for a largely naive population, we believe that the 10 and the 25 would have sufficient overlap that they really would confound expectancy. And while we didn't actually measure expectancy in the phase 2b, all the evidence from patients, from physicians, and so on was that was effective. What we heard, that the 2b was very successful, and as you know, we saw response and remission rates up in the 20% plus, which compares obviously very, very favorably to study that you quoted earlier. But what we heard loud and clear from many, both physicians and patients, was maybe a second dose would actually help to consolidate response,
Okay.
push response to a higher level, perhaps extend durability. And you
Mm,
can see this hypothesis now has got a lot of legs with other studies and so on as well.
yep.
But for 006, it's the same 3 arms, with a second fixed dose at 3 weeks. The 3 weeks was chosen so that we could have the primary endpoint at 6 weeks, consistent with 005. So both of them had the primary endpoint at 6 weeks. What that means is that the primary endpoint is actually 3 weeks after that second dose.
Yeah,
So 3 arms, 2 times 1, 2 times 10, 2 times 25. Similar part B, blinded, where again, patients will have the option of a third dose if they choose, depending on meeting certain criteria. And finally, the same open label, weeks 26 to 52. So the potential for some patients of a fourth dose in that open label extension.
I see. I was listening to you on Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago. You stated Compass is 2 for 2 in the phase 2B, Comp 005 with the data that's been released. But not only are you 2 for 2, you're 2 for 2 with one study against placebo and another study, low, medium, high dose. And this matches FDA draft guidance from 2023. You know, Maybe we could speak about this further with my next question, but I think that is important to note here. And I think it is a good segue to, you know, Compass has one of my favorite mission statements in the space. You're a biotechnology company dedicated to accelerating patient access to evidence-based innovation in mental health. With that being said, what does this strategy look like in practice?
So first around the acceleration piece of that. So just to build on your question, absolutely, we are 2 for 2. And I think, as I've said in other places, I think that's unique because the only other drug that's ever been approved for TRD was esketamine that actually required
Yep.
5 studies to get to 2 successful. But we'll settle for the word remarkable because it is, because in psychiatry, replication from 2 to 3 is hard. And then it's particularly hard to treat depression. That's especially remarkable. We said clearly that we have requested a meeting with the agency. We're meeting with them in this quarter to discuss regulatory strategy, to discuss if there's any possibility for acceleration. Again, to be clear, our base case continues to be that we need 005 and 006. That is the basis for our current agreement with the agency. 2 well-designed phase 3 studies that exactly meet the criteria they set out in their draft guidance. But clearly, if there are ways to do that, and let's recognize there are a number of voices in the administration today that are talking about a desire to accelerate, that are talking about they see the same potential that we see for these things to be a new tool for patients and physicians. So we'll see. We'll see if there's an opportunity to accelerate. From an access perspective, as I said, Compass was always set up with the fact that we need to get that regulatory approval, which would then allow us to talk not just to commercial insurers, but to CMS. As a reminder, depression, antidepressants are one of the 6 protected classes. So
Mm.
that requires CMS to actually start paying immediately for that. So again, we're very focused on how quickly we can move through those regulatory hurdles and into an approval and to reimbursement discussions. All that said, we're not asking for psychedelic exceptionalism. We're not asking for anyone to say psychedelics are held to a different standard. They need to be held to the same standard as any other psychiatry drugs.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up and also the rigorous scientific approach Compass is taking. Um, I'd like to ask you because I'm a real big fan of how Compass talks about Comp 360, the potential of it. I think you guys do a really good job messaging around it. With that being said, I guess looking at the space, how do we find a fine balance between, there's one side in psychedelics in the media, which are like fear mongering, and the other side is, this is a miracle cure for everyone who takes it. How do you think about that? Yeah.
It's you're right, and I'll be honest, it's sometimes a source of frustration. We clearly can't control the broader lay media and so on. But first, let me say the zeitgeist is helpful. I mean, clearly a zeitgeist where people are talking about psychedelics as a potential new tool is ultimately helpful to Compass.
Okay. Yeah.
I hate the hype, and we do not use the word cure or solution or anything else. And I think there are a couple of important points to distill here. First, we as a sponsor and a manufacturer do not dictate medical practice, the practice of medicine, or how COMP360 may be integrated into a patient's overall treatment and treatment journey. And why is that really important? We recognize that patients may well benefit from therapy.
Hmm.
What we also know, though, is in that 6 or so hour intense subjective experience with psilocybin, there is actually no role for therapy,
Hmm.
for intervention, for direction. It's a largely inner directed um, process where people are working through their own work. So, in the context of the administration of COMP360, there is no therapy. But again, to be clear, we want people to integrate that into their overall journey, and that may include therapy and so on. So we're clear that COMP360 is one additional tool for patients and physicians. It's not a cure. There may be a very small handful of people who are lucky enough
Hmm.
to achieve complete, long-lasting, truly durable remission for years. That shouldn't be the expectation. Depression is not something that is likely to be cured in that sense.
Hmm.
But we do believe that an episodic administration, what we're trying to show in phase 3, can be profoundly effective for a number of patients. And for every patient, there will be an individual treatment journey that includes that and potentially other mechanisms, other modalities as well.
So you don't use the word cure, which again, I appreciate that. With that being said, if approved, COM360 could be a highly differentiated treatment option. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are when people describe psychedelic medicine as having the potential, not curative, but disease modifying.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because disease modifying, as you know, is a phrase that's used frequently in particular areas like immunology and so on. It hasn't typically been used in psychiatry. It's used to some degree in
Uh,
neurodegeneration and so on as well. And it's part of the holy grail for, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on. So I think what I would say is we don't regard depression as a disease, as just kind of
mm,
with
yeah.
hard, inverted commas around it. We recognize that there's a complex mix of environmental, social, other factors that contribute to any given person in a certain setting having the symptoms of depression where another person might not. And so what I would say is I do believe that psychedelics can achieve profound remission, not just on depression scores, but can also achieve profound effects in terms of people's quality of life,
Yeah.
willingness, ability to function without the physical side effects that we see from typical antidepressants. And so we have captured in our phase 2B and we'll capture in our phase 3 a number of those scores and so on. And your question is a really good reminder because we tend to get very focused on MADRS and the regulatory standard,
Yeah.
but that is only scratching the surface of what psychedelics can achieve. So, in that sense, can a psychedelic experience be life modifying for many people? Absolutely. But I would prefer to use that rather than disease modifying.
Wow, I really like that. I've never heard that before. Life modifying. That sounds great. And yeah, thinking about MADRS scores, people have always said you can't capture all of the potential benefits of psychedelics looking at the MADRS. So it's great to hear you're looking at other measurements of maybe life satisfaction and so on. So, Kabir, thank you so much for coming on the channel. Really appreciate it. I know Psychedelic Advantage subscribers are going to be really excited to see this one. I'd like to leave you off with, looking ahead, what do you see as the most important milestones for Compass and for the broader field of psychedelic medicine?
For Compass, we clearly have more phase 3 data coming, and that's really important. So, not only the 26 weeks from OO5, also the data from OO6, the second study, because we do believe the second dose could indeed lead to kind of better remission response rates, potentially greater durability. So, that's really important. Obviously, the regulatory engagement is also really critical to see how that goes and how that evolves. I think for the field as a whole, all good data sets are really welcome. So it's been thrilling to see in the last few months great data from Reunion, from Beckley, and so on, because I think it's really important that we show that this is replicable. There are a number of different mechanisms which, when studied appropriately in the right way, can really bring benefit to patients. More broadly, clearly the first approval, whoever that is going to be a huge milestone for this sector because there is skepticism about what happens next, about how we bring these forward. We at Compass are very, very focused on ensuring we leverage the Serato infrastructure, build the other tools necessary so that we will be able to deliver this at scale if we're approved. So I think that first approval will be a key thing as well.
Compass, I think another thing, last thing important to note, Compass has really assembled an all-star team. And yeah, with that being said, I'm excited to see what the team can accomplish in the coming months and years. Thank you so much again, Kabir.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's been a pleasure.